I'd like to call this work session order. We've been discussing industrial lands. It's a follow-up to the earlier meeting we had. Let's go around the table, identify ourselves to the record. Assembly members first. We'll start with you, Mr. Flynn.
Patrick Flynn.
Amy Domboski.
Dick Trainey.
Elby Gray Jackson.
Tyler Robinson.
Bill Reed, Handling Economics.
Okay. Julia. Okay. And we've got
Tom Davis. Tom Davis.
Tom Davis.
just want to get it on the record. Welcome to the meeting. We'll turn the time over to you.
Okay.
And if there are questions from assembly members, just raise your hand and I'll get you put on the list. Do you want us to ask questions during it or at the end when you're all done?
I would say you're welcome to ask questions during.
Okay.
All right,
We can do that.
Backed by popular demand is Bill Reed. On February 6th at the work session to review the findings of our industrial land assessment, we reported that there is a deficit in industrial zone land in terms of our future industrial need looking forward 20 to 25 years. And one of the questions that the assembly members asked was, that's interesting, but what are the key industrial sectors, what are the key economic sectors that we really need to be worried about? In May, we presented the same results to the Planning and Zoning Commission. The Planning and Zoning Commission's response was, okay, so what? What about the industrial uses if we have a land deficit? Can we just look at moving them up the highway? What's the importance? And finally, the Industrial Land Committee, and I see a few members here from that Industrial Land Committee that helped us do the report. I see Tim Potter and Bill Steyer, along with a couple of commissioners, Tyler Robinson. One of their key recommendations from the industrial land analysis was that we do look at, okay, we have a land deficit, but what are those most important or traded economic sectors among the industrial uses? Fortunately, Bill Reed is available, and we were able to do that follow-up analysis. So what we will do today is have Bill present that analysis and the findings about what are the key traded sectors and what are their policy implications for land use, balancing the different competing land uses in the bowl as we go forward in land use planning. We will also include, Bill will include in the latter part of his work session, he'll review with you his findings from the industrial study about the potential impact of a future marijuana industry. So I'll let Bill get started, and I'll be over here tinkering with our old computer getting this.
Thank you.
Take it away, Bill, and I will.
Yeah, no, Tom's getting it. Tom's doing good stuff. So again, thank you for having me back to come and talk about traded industry sectors and industrial land need in Anchorage. Just kind of follow up on what Tom said. Back in February and in May, we heard that Anchorage Bowl and Anchorage Shipyard to take a look at industrial land need over a 20-year period. If you look at what's currently zoned industrial, different types of industrial use, you don't have enough land over the next 20 years to accommodate all of the potential growth that Anchorage should see under normal circumstances over a 20-year period. So my task this time around was to go through and try to figure out, or go through the process of figuring out what individual industrial using industry sectors have more consequence for the local economy, and therefore, relatively speaking, and therefore are worth prioritizing in terms of policies regarding industrial land. I want to be clear. The message here isn't that some industrial users and some businesses are less welcome or more welcome than others. But given that you have identified over the past few years that you are lacking 20-year capacity of land for all major land uses, and there are pressures for some uses to convert to others, there's kind of some choices that have to be made regarding how you're going to prioritize your economic development initiatives and how that translates into industrial land issues. So what I've gone through and done is identified for you what in economic development and international trade basically are defined as traded sectors or traded industry sectors. And basically, Anchorage's economy, any regional economy is broken down into, can be broken down into two distinct, there it is, thank you, Tom. Just keep going. Actually, I reviewed all the previous findings. There's some of the previous policy suggestions that you have heard before regarding what may or may not be appropriate for how to preserve land, add land capacity, and how to make judicious choices about what types of industrial development that you retain or try to attract.
So we have the actual presentation en route. This is a background document that I think that we'll just wait for the actual presentation and we'll pass that. So everything you see, you will have in your hands. So no need to take notes on what you see unless you.
Sorry, Amy.
And maybe if we could turn the lights down a little bit.
Okay, so we can. Okay, so you're going to have to forgive me. I'm going to walk through and kind of discuss what a traded industry sector is and establish why it's important and what distinguishes it from other types of industrial sectors in the economy, and why traded industry sectors are worth prioritizing in terms of land use policy and other jurisdictions in other parts of the country, West Coast certainly, port cities, have gone through a similar process. You are doing it earlier in the game than a lot of other jurisdictions have. A lot of jurisdictions have gone through and tried to protect or preserve industrial land kind of much further into the process of conversion. So you're ahead of the game in many respects. So this is just a bit of information about what a local industry is versus a traded industry. Local industries, just to distinguish before we get into traded industries, local industries are really kind of anything that produces goods or services in the local economy for consumption in the local economy. And right off the bat, I want to say those are the ones that I'm going to urge you to consider viewing as lower priority from an industrial land use perspective. Everybody needs to go to the grocery store. Most people dine out. Everybody should pay their taxes. Those are all things that typically are done in the local economy and dollars that stay in the local economy, circulating over and over again. They're necessary, but they don't bring any new dollars into the economy. They're just services and goods provided back and forth within a local area. A traded sector is simply defined as any industry, any sector that does business outside of the region, has customers outside of the region. So brings dollars from customers not in Anchorage, whether that's up in the Matsu Borough, whether it's elsewhere in the state of Alaska, whether it's internationally or somewhere in the lower 48. As long as dollars are being earned by selling goods and services outside of Anchorage itself, it's a traded sector. Okay? Those are the sectors that bring in dollars that wouldn't ordinarily be here and can just kind of statically circulate. And they're industries that typically pay well above the average wage for a region because of their access to markets and far more customers than just local sectors have. So the problem with local industry sectors is that because it's kind of a static circulation of dollars back and forth, grocery, haircuts, taxes, that sort of thing. If anybody in a local economy chooses to go somewhere and spend money, that's leakage of economic activity that doesn't stay in. And so for an economy to at least be stable and to grow, there have to be traded sectors that are bringing dollars in that overcompensate for any leakage that leaves the economy because people go somewhere and spend their PFD on a trip to Hawaii, that sort of thing. So the idea here is that traded sectors are important for purposes of retaining and bringing dollars in jobs that pay well above average for a region, as well as for typically for other industrial using sectors. Let's see, anything else? For the most part, traded sectors are largely industrial land using sectors, and they're typically tied to natural resources and manufacturing, which are very important here. certainly in Anchorage. As long as a sector of business is doing more commerce with folks outside of the region and bringing dollars in, they're technically a traded sector. That can include business headquarters, native corporations, major engineering firms that do a lot of services outside, elsewhere in the state or wherever. Even though they're using largely using office space, oil industry headquarters. Even though they're all largely using office space, they still are traded sectors. So there are some traded sectors that use office space largely, or office commercial space largely. And in the case of Anchorage, and other places where there's a lot of tourism, if you have a lot of people coming in from outside and spending money, technically that counts as traded sector too. You're bringing dollars in from other markets. Might be that they're coming to you, but they're still bringing money from outside in. So that's the idea. So I'm going to go through and kind of identify how I would urge you to view traded industry sectors in Anchorage, which ones should be recognized as traded industry sectors, and then which ones very specifically from an industrial land use perspective should be viewed as high priority and industrial traded industry sectors. Next time. There's a number of different ways to define what a traded sector is. Is it just the total dollar volume? Actually, you can go ahead and I think you can. Yeah. Let me go ahead and go into this one. It gets into the specifics. If businesses bring out just massive volume of trade trade dollars in from outside of the region back in, that's one way of defining it. Some local sectors are gigantic and they do a bunch of business within Anchorage as well. And so they don't have like a high percentage of their sales necessarily from outside of the region. So in some businesses that actually do more business outside versus within Anchorage probably should get special consideration. So that's a little bit different from just sheer dollar volume. And then firms that end up hiring more and paying better wages, that should also go into the mix. There are some traded industry sectors that don't. I mean, if tourism and retail that serves tourism is considered part of a traded industry because of the tourism factor, they just don't historically typically pay very good wages. So should they get the same level of priority from a policy perspective as others that pay higher, closer to family wages? That's the idea. So after going through all of that, and given that you're dealing with a situation where industrial land is scarce over the next 20 years, and other land use types are scarce over the next 20 years, the most efficient way I would recommend viewing what a traded industry sector is, how much trade revenue is being brought in per employee for that sector. Just kind of sheer efficiency of trade by the amount of employees that they have. They don't necessarily have to be gigantic firms, but if they're doing a really great job of pulling dollars in per employee, kind of based on scarcity issues, that's probably a better way to go, all things said, besides just those other factors. So I apologize for the table having some smaller, it's a big table, there are 20 sectors here. And it'll be in the handout when it arrives, so you can take a look at it, get a good look at it. If you prioritize the top 20 industry sectors within the Anchorage economy by sheer volume of business revenues and international trade, well, domestic international, so total export trade. This is the list of the top 20 sectors. Petroleum extraction and pipeline transportation, all of the headquarter white-collar jobs related to that are overwhelmingly lead the local economy on that basis. And then you get into transportation, professional and business services, medical, social services, tourism. This is the profile of really kind of the major drivers in the industry. And if you look at on sheer volume of exports, export trade that brings dollars back in, average wage for all those industries is about nearly 80,000, and 50 to 60 is the average per job right now in Anchorage.
On telecommunications, is the export basically selling access to outside carriers to those who are utilizing those facilities in the state, or, yeah?
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
And any commerce and service to customers, GCI, statewide, all of the revenue from statewide operations outside of Anchorage, that gets included. So it recognizes that Anchorage serves as the center for that industry as well, and the quote unquote good jobs for them are centered in Anchorage also.
Okay, do you have a rough idea of how much of that is, for example, from tourists utilizing the networks while they're visiting here?
That I don't. I mean, I would have to dig in. I would have to see if there are even available data on that. Maybe there are, but with the information I was able to get for this type of analysis, that's not included.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. No problem. Thank you, Tom. Okay, so I went through, and just for contrast purposes, here are the 20 industry sectors in Anchorage that do the least amount of trade in total volume. There are actually kind of 54 distinct industry sectors in Anchorage. And this is the list of the ones that do the least amount of trade. They pay an average of about $47,000 a year on average, and that's 42% lower than what the high volume export sectors do. These are important industries and businesses, and some of them employ a lot of people, but they overwhelmingly do business in Anchorage with other Anchorage businesses, or whether it's commerce that goes elsewhere, but they're doing business with Anchorage businesses. So they're important sectors, but they're not necessarily bringing new dollars in under the traded sector definition. Let's see. So if we order all the sectors based on the idea that we want to recognize, again, in a scarce land supply environment, if we want to recognize the industries that are most efficiently bringing dollars in from outside of Anchorage per job, per employee, these are the top 20 sectors, starting with, there we go. Again, the oil industry cluster here in Anchorage leads the way. But then a number of different manufacturing firms actually rise to the top. Anchorage's manufacturing sector, it's not gigantic. There's about 2,600 total jobs here. It's certainly not as large as some of the other ones. But just based on a per job kind of efficiency rate of bringing dollars into the local economy, they, in many respects, lead the way. And a number of them have actually been growing quite well, actually. We'll get into that in a little bit. A few others that showed up, besides a number of your manufacturers, metal ore mining, which is largely kind of gold company headquarters that are here in Anchorage, as well as water and air transportation, which shouldn't be water transportation. Air transportation is going to show up in a little bit. There's a lot of domestic travel in the air transportation industry that didn't get them on this first top 20 list. But anyway, these are the major industries that, on a per employee basis, do the heavy lifting regarding bringing new dollars into the economy. Okay, let's see. We'll go ahead. Yeah. So in that list, there were a number of There were a number of sectors that use overwhelmingly office, and so all this slide is explaining is, if we're going to take a look at industrial land using traded sectors, we need to pull those folks out because they're using office space. We want to look at the folks who use actual industrial land and develop industrial type facilities. Petroleum sector, and no, it's okay. Petroleum sector, real estate, and the office using component of professional business services, which is largely a native corporation headquarters that do a lot of business, but they're overwhelmingly office users, so they're not going to be considered for industrial. Okay, so these are the 20 sectors that overwhelmingly use industrial land in Anchorage, and per employee pull in the most trade dollars from outside of Anchorage, whether it's from elsewhere in the state, internationally, lower 48, doesn't matter. These are the top 20, and again, a lot of the manufacturing sectors that you have here, power generation actually comes in, as well as air and water transportation. Let's see, there was one other one that kind of popped up. where is it? Gravel miner, non-metallic mineral mining. That's the other one.
I know that one well.
So again, overall, these sectors pay quite a bit better than the Anchorage average. And from an industrial land using and trade efficiency perspective, these are your top performers.
What year was this data from?
2013, most recent I can get at this level of business.
Had they consolidated the aggregate operations at AS&G from Granite at that time? Do you remember?
I'm not sure about the timing of that, whether it shows up in here or not.
Okay.
The great thing about where I get this information from is that it's about as detailed a portrait. I don't have to sign any non-disclosure forms. It's actually a really nice, detailed bit of information about the local economy. But I get everything I want to know about 1 year and 1 year only. So we'll talk a little bit about some historical performance of these.
Tim, do you remember what year they consolidated the aggregate delivery to AS&G's operation and closed down Grants?
It's been about 3 years ago.
Okay, so it's probably included.
So this will be the first
Okay.
year after.
All right. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so here's just some context for these sectors. Overall, those 20 individual sectors in Anchorage, according to state data for employment growth, those sectors combined grew by 4.1% annually in terms of employment between 2009 and 2013. So those 20 were actually the fastest recovering sectors, among the fastest recovering sectors in the economy. This table has to do with what growth is expected in the sectors. But historically, those 20 combined added 4.1% new jobs every year after the Great Recession. Overall, the Anchorage economy added jobs at a rate of 1.1%. So they very well outperformed the local economy in general. Moving forward, this forecast, which ultimately is based on information from the state forecast, with some tweaks regarding what the kindergarten crossing may or may not do, which aren't dramatic in these numbers. The 20 traded industry sectors that have been identified are expected to grow by 1.3% annually. The forecast is somewhat pessimistic, but these overall for the overall economy, I mean it's steady, but it's not great. Those 20 sectors are expected to continue to outperform the economy in general. So this is a bit of information about the kind of information specifically about the businesses themselves. It's a start to kind of build the information about what kind of industrial land and sites they need, and what's going to be important to think about. In terms of the businesses the sectors that are identified, for the most part, they're largely smaller, more moderately sized firms. I mean, we're not talking a bunch of really big firms here for the most part. There are quite a few kind of in the medium range, which businesses of this size typically will require up to 5 sites, up to 5 acres-ish, if they want to have a little bit of extra room to expand if and when they need to. You get above 5 acres, 5 to 10 and above, 5 to 20 in here, and then 20 acres and above, 20 acre sites and above for these types of firms. So as you can see, you're looking at smaller firms needing 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 acre sites for the most part over time. Not that gigantic employers, but still good solid employers that are outperforming the economy in general. One of the questions that came up, and we'll discuss more, or at least maybe answer some questions more about what parts of Anchorage or Anchorage-Chugiak might work for some of these businesses as they grow. Are they going to want or need to stay in the Anchorage Bowl? Would they, or can they or would they move up north based on what kind of infrastructure is or isn't available? And this information basically just shows how much money, what percentage of money each of these kind of sector groups are spending on different major utilities versus how much proportionally they're spending on major transportation infrastructure and services is the idea here. So for all of your manufacturers who are in that top 20 list, the power and transmission group, and your aggregate mining, basically, but the non-metallic mining utilities spending on the far right. There's quite a fire. Electricity, electrical power is overwhelmingly going to be needed by these subsectors. So, in thinking about different parts of Anchorage where they will stay to grow, where they might move to over time, high capacity power is going to be important. For manufacturers, natural gas is extremely important, but not as much for electricity. And then for your manufacturers, water and sewer, there's a lot of food processing that's in there, beverage manufacture that's grown a lot. So water and sewer for your manufacturing sector has gotten more important, but for your other ones, it's not quite as important. And then this just points out that for all three of these subsectors, there's a couple more in a second. Trucking, obviously, to no surprise, is a gigantic need and a major part of their expense, the transportation expense. But then after that, it kind of gets, some of them go straight over to the airport and ship out to other markets on cargo planes. Others actually still continue to capitalize on rail, particularly, of course, metallic mining. Thanks, Tom. Air and water transportation and professional business services, similar thing. Again, electricity is the overwhelming utility of choice and need, with natural gas coming in a distant second for transportation. And then water sewer is more important for these folks. Let's see, transportation infrastructure, again, trucking, gigantic in the transportation industry and what all the activities that they do. But for professional business services, your engineering firms, your environmental services firms, the ones who are in that sector but using industrial land, they use a lot of air transportation during the year, as well as on-the-ground transit and truck traffic. Anyway, just to break down, to kind of get a sense of, if you're going to prioritize these 20 sectors, these are the utilities and transportation infrastructure, proportionately speaking, that areas receiving or allowing these folks to grow need to have. Let's see, we have some kind of bullet slipped around, it's okay. So just kind of summarize about the traded industries in Anchorage. They're in 5 general groups. A number of manufacturing sectors, power generation and transmission is what that should say. Non-metallic mineral mining, air and water transportation, and industrial site and land using portion of professional and business services, engineering firms, science technical firms that have laboratory space, that sort of thing, the ones that kind of need the flexible or light industrial space. Those are your 5, if you were to group those 20 kind of distinctly. They pay 17% higher than the local average wage. They're 8% of the local economy, 13,000 jobs, but they generate 13% of total business sales in the economy. They added jobs nearly 4 times as fast as the overall economy did since the Great Recession. And then information about utilities and infrastructure for each one of them. So this is just kind of a setup slide to kind of review that, you're looking at making choices about how the municipality is going to address industrial land need when at the same time residential and commercial have very similar 20-year undersupply issues. And so what I want to do is just kind of go through a brief discussion, hopefully, not going to be too brief, but kind of talk about the economics behind why the 3 uses compete for land the way they do, or kind of conflict or react to scarce land in scarce capacity in different ways. So to the extent that this graph is helpful. So for each of the major land uses, each of these bars represent basically what portion of their business, kind of business and site development costs, how they kind of proportionately stack up against one another. How much they look at in terms of utilities, labor, equipment, and then how they think about the cost of the structure and for the site, and how they think about the land underneath it. And so this is kind of a cross comparison. Typically, industrial users have extremely expensive utilities for whatever business function they're doing. They require proportionately more skilled labor than the other sectors do. Their equipment's expensive and they replace it frequently, so they're spending a lot of money on that. They need specialized structures typically for what they do that are flexible for what they do inside. So they can be somewhat expensive, but if they can make it as less expensive as they can, they will. And what ends up happening is that for industrial users, they deal with all of these higher costs and then try to solve for how little they can pay for the land underneath the building. Okay, they can't pay a lot of money for land because everything else that they do is so expensive. Now, alternatively, retail is the exact opposite. Utilities aren't what they are for industrial, but they are for keeping business open and running. Labor is among the cheapest of the major land uses. Equipment's not a major expense for them. So what they end up doing is building a nice, high quality, flashy, highly visible, welcoming structure. And because most of their other costs aren't that big, they can afford to and need to pay a premium for ideal sites for where to set up shop and get traffic in from visibility and high traffic locations. So they end up having the exact opposite issue that industrial does. They can spend they can spend far more on a site than industrial can, and that's the conflict basically. Office is a little bit different. They can build up depending on what land prices are, what the demand and type of demand for office space is. So their structure ends up being potentially very expensive, but it's for lease space typically. So there's far less cost regarding labor and utilities when thinking about office development. So office can end up paying more for land than industrial typically, but usually not as much as retail. They don't have to be in a key high visibility, high traffic location to attract shoppers. They just need to be in a good location to be near other clients, customers, and in a commercial district. So prices tend to be a little bit higher, but not like for retail. And residential, that's just renting or selling. There's no employment issues or any of that sort of thing. So structure finish, whatever it is typically very high per square foot. And they end up wanting to try not to pay as much for land and try to build as many units as needed to try to spread the cost of land across those units to make the project pencil out or be financially feasible. So ultimately, retail can pay the most and industrial can pay the least for land, and there's the problem. So this is just kind of a restatement of what I went through regarding office and residential. Again, so the upshot of it all is that in a land-constrained environment, retail and office can usually, if not always, pay more for the same site that might have been zoned or appropriate for industrial that would otherwise happen as industrial if land supply constraint and land cost issues weren't a problem. Kind of further compounding the situation is that retail and industrial both need pretty quick and easy access to high capacity road infrastructure basically. In the case of retail, a lot of people driving by and seeing the shop or the business and pulling in and for to shop. And industrial, just basically for flexibility and speed for truck traffic. But they basically end up kind of having similar site criteria in some ways. The thing to keep in mind though that retail and industrial are going to be the ones that end up being the interesting policy choices regarding how to handle that conflict. But the thing to remember is that ultimately, retail adds to the quality of life in the region. People enjoy seeing new retailers coming in. Lack of choice of existing retail is frequently something, and commercial offerings is frequently something that people like to see improve over time, certainly. But regarding retail versus industrial development, industrial development, particularly traded industry sectors, pay far better in terms of jobs. And when you get a development coming in for a lifetime of 20 plus years, you're talking about the choice between higher family wage jobs on a site versus something that it meets a need in the community in terms of retail, but is locking in jobs that pay usually significantly less. And industrial users, a level of investment, the wages that they pay, and then therefore allow those households kind of afford homes better than retail jobs can, and the taxes that they pay. There's a lot more return on investment for public infrastructure from industrial development versus lower wage paying retail development. So that's kind of the balance. So this is just a chart that summarizes how tolerant or how different the major land uses typically can or will react to limited supply for land and higher land costs that result from that. Starting with industrial, it's not shocking. They don't have really any tolerance for land prices and development costs to go up. If they need to expand, they really can't build up. They've got machines, manufacturing operations, and other business operations that can't be stacked. Some buildings can put office in a second story. There is that ability, but very rarely do you see anything industrial over 2 stories. It's truly industrial. If things get really expensive, they're going to relocate to something absolutely cheaper, but still has the infrastructure and utilities they need. And over time, if there's retail and industrial moving into an area with existing industrial, the traffic conflict makes it more and more difficult for the industrial user. So there's that as well. Retail can tolerate higher land costs pretty well. They can't build up significantly. They'll go 3-4 stories, maybe shopping center, that sort of thing. But the nice thing, one of the things about retail is that it's actually a positive thing for shops to have, or businesses to have higher sales per square foot. To the extent that a retail chain doesn't have the number of shops in Anchorage that they would like, their sales per square foot are higher. That's kind of the main outcome. So retail businesses should want to and need to expand, but they can accommodate some of the issues a little better, certainly better than industrial. Office is the one that can deal with land prices and land scarcity the best. They can go high-rise fairly, compared to the other uses, much easier. They have here in Anchorage. The issue is just volume of demand for office space at going lease rates, and what type of parking costs on top of structure costs might be in order. That's the only issue. And then residential, you've heard a lot about that, so I'm not adding too much here, but residential, once you get over the hump of figuring out what some of the obstacles are here that have been discussed regarding residential, they can build up, or they should be able to build up. But the issue is, what are the development costs and the price that they have to achieve to make a project pencil? Multifamily housing is typically no more than 40-45% of your household population. If you look at metro area wide in different parts of the country for the most part, 40-45% of households will choose and actively live in multifamily housing, and the rest will be in single family. So you're already off the bat dealing with a minority share of your population anyway. So it's not limited market, but it's a smaller share of the market. So you have a number of factors that combine and complicate how well residential can accommodate issues. Tom, John.
You want to pass the hot off the press? We have the.
It is here, huh?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yes. Okay. So this is just kind of a restatement of the case for why the trade sectors
Thank you.
are important, and what I think I would urge you to think about in terms of. But the bottom line is your industrial sectors, your industrial land users, whether they're traded sectors or not, technically, they're still among the highest paying sectors you have in Anchorage, and they're foundational to the state's economy, largely because of the oil. Oil industry does what it does, but it's still vital, and a lot of the users support that. Industrial users support that, among other things. They typically pay the highest return on investment for Anchorage and the state regarding use of transportation infrastructure, as well as using that infrastructure get goods and services to market wherever it may be, versus some of the other sectors that really kind of serve them. Traded industry sectors themselves are, I would urge you to think about as being really kind of those key industrial land sectors that really are deserving of consideration regarding industrial land scarcity as we move forward. They're essential to the economy, they bring the dollars in, that overcompensate for leakage when people spend outside and do what they do. But they also pay significantly higher. And then those households are paid more and can afford more housing choices. And then they also have more disposable income and support more retail and services than other uses that perhaps have employment that don't pay as much in wages. Let's see. So the idea here is that all of this is just to say that the traded industry sector analysis that I kind of ran through and that you have information about in front of you continues to support the policy recommendations that you heard about back in February. Basically that industrial land is worth protecting and preserving. But you certainly now have a better idea about which industry sectors kind of are more of a consequence to the local economy versus those that are still important but don't serve the same function and support quite as much in the economy. So you kind of have an idea of how to prioritize potentially based on traded industry sectors. Over time, when we worked with the industrial advisory group, they made it pretty clear that the Anchorage Bowl is still the preferred place for business to occur. But over time, Chugiak Eagle River is going to grow in that role. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that may come up with marijuana industry if it's at all like Denver. That process will accelerate a bit potentially. But the other idea here is that when we went through the industrial land study process, we weren't sure about how much infrastructure or what types of infrastructure that Chugiak Eagle River industrial land may or may not need to appeal to businesses that might want to expand up there rather than stay in Anchorage. And we have a better idea now about the utilities and infrastructure that they're definitely going to need and how Chugiak Eagle River should be, industrial land there should be thought about kind of in a more detailed way, so to speak. And again, so this is just a map of the sub-areas, largely industrial areas in the Anchorage Bowl. And, again, it's, we can talk more about the different areas and kind of what their key assets are and what the conflicts are. But for each one of these, they're going to be able to play a different role for your economy over time, particularly for industrial business growth, trade sector industry growth. And as you talk about and look at each of these sub-areas, as you move forward with all of this, it's, again, the recommendation that there be less flexibility for non-industrial uses is a valid one, particularly for the traded industry sectors that you have, and trying to at least ensure that those really key ones can grow here in Anchorage and ever continue to stay in the bowl or in Chugiak Eagle River, as long as they're not migrating further north and then leaving your economy. That's the idea. And so I guess let me stop there before I kind of just do a brief review of what we found about the marijuana industry and potential demand for industrial land and space. Were there any questions about any of that previous information about industry sectors?
Question from assembly members. Tyler.
The map, two questions. The map that you show reflects, it doesn't necessarily reflect zoning, it doesn't necessarily reflect use. What is it actually reflecting?
Concentration of existing industrial users.
But it's taking surrounding properties that may not be industrial and kind of lumping them in there.
No, that's correct. This is a map of the study areas, and our approach in the study was, in addition to looking at existing industrial uses, we were casting a wide net to leave no stone unturned as to what could be potential future areas. So admittedly, some of these sub-areas go a little bit beyond the industrial zones to capture all the existing industrial uses and any lands that any observers have asked us about Fire Island or other vacant lands. What about this? So we studied all those lands. So, but generally those do follow the general location of the existing industrial clusters in Anchorage.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
The idea, I think I understand how you have policy input on whether something is industrial versus retail or residential. Are you, in distinguishing the different traded sectors and having some that are more impactful than others, what are the types of policy recommendations that can actually support some over others? I mean, in other words, it's not the zoning. The zoning would be consistent and, you know, if it's industrial land, if someone's willing to pay for it, they can be anywhere on that. But what are the types of things that other communities do to actually support those within those industrial use areas?
Well, the big thing I would say is that setting up whatever restrictions on non-industrial uses or outright bans on non-industrial uses in areas that allow, the main thing is to provide assurance to those industries, to the traded sector employers who are in a particular area, or other industrial users potentially who aren't traded sector employers. The idea is to provide assurances that the area that they're in, they will have the ability to expand in the future, okay? And the ability for unpredictable or disruptive non-industrial uses to encroach and kind of take away the assurance that they can expand where and how they want to, if they want to, you know, buy or take down an adjacent property or whatever. Anything that kind of leaves doubts or puts unpredictability into that planning process is incentive for that business if they want to expand to just go to the least cost location north. And that's the idea. So in Seattle, the Duwamish corridor, there are very restrictive zoning regulations for absolutely banning non-industrial uses, except for accessory sandwich shops, just kind of daytime serving retail, but no retail, that sort of thing. And that basically just kind of ensures that whatever the industrial building inventory is in the area or the vacant land that's there, nothing's going to come in and disrupt kind of that. That's the idea.
Tim, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There's a great article in The Stranger about Harbor Island, whether or not it qualifies as a neighborhood or not. You should read it. My old stomping ground.
Mr. Steele.
Yeah, I guess I'm at a quandary as to how to ask the question, but you showed the value of what the native corporations bring in and their value, but they're a component like government that does not pay taxes, so tax-free in terms of land costs. Is that type of thing figured in at all in terms of what you're encouraging?
Well, with the native corporations, they're overwhelmingly office users, so they're kind of off the table for what we're talking about. They overwhelmingly use office space. Yeah. So from an industrial land regulatory economic development perspective, they have value in terms of the jobs they have and the wages they pay. Kind of have that same effect that industrial does. They're, they employees there have can afford more housing choices than other sectors pay, that sort of thing. And they do bring a lot of dollars into the economy, but they're not industrial users per se, so they're not in this.
Yeah, and I think government, in a similar way, they bring dollars into the community, perhaps. I mean, they bring it in terms of the jobs and stuff, but they don't necessarily bring it in terms of they may be spending those dollars elsewhere.
Right, and government was not one of the.
Yeah.
I mean, it's government is a percentage function of the private economy. And that's kind of how I view it. It's an essential function, but it's kind of a percentage portion. As the private economy expands, that just puts more demand for services at a proportionate share. So it's important, but it's not a driver compared to the other ones are.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot more of it than other areas in the state, out in the valley, and so on and so forth.
We have about 10 minutes left. Tom, I've got a question for you. I can look at this map that says industrial land use Cherokee River. Do we have one that breaks down the amount of electricity, the type of electricity provided to River Chugach area? because as you point out in your slides, electricity is a factor in consideration. MLNP and MEA are the two areas that can provide power to Chugach Eagle River area. And I just want to know if we have a map that can show an individual what type of power is being delivered there. I'm concerned about, for example, 600 watt three-phase power going into the airport because they need that for manufacturing. I want to know where that's available at, so as people are looking for where they can put their sites at, I want to make sure they've got adequate power. They don't have to wait 6 months or a year and go through a couple of different boards to try and get power.
Right, Chugach Electric actually provided us with some data, and we haven't yet converted
But
that
Phil
into a
left,
map,
so,
but what we
okay.
can do is, over the next couple of weeks, either include a map with Bill's report about traded sectors, or include a map as we bring forward materials about
Okay.
the new land use plan map.
I would be interested in the three, Chugach, MLNP, and MEA, because I want to make sure we've got adequate power. And if we don't have one company, one business is not servicing, then how do we change the game to provide power? Because these guys need to know if they're going to come in and do industrial, the power is available, whether it's marijuana or what it is. Sugar, it's there. Tim, do you have something quickly?
I just had a question, and it'll come into play when you start developing the actual policies and implementing that. And that there's not an environmental map associated with this, and I know that that's part of the discussion. So when you look at the industrial category of uses, how much they can afford for land to purchase it, and then the development cost for land. Some of our land in town, in the industrial identified area in South Anchorage, has 15, 20 feet apiece, and the cost of development, let alone the acquisition is small compared to the relative cost of actually creating the land to support a building and operation. So, will there be an environmental component to selecting and implementing the industrial uses of that facility?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely.
Let me go to Amy, and then I want him to finish up the marijuana thing. Amy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I could probably wrap my question into your spiel when you get into marijuana.
Sure.
So my question is, we invited MEA out here. There's a local electric provider for the Chugach Eagle River area because Mr. Trainee has alluded to it. We recognize the industrial area in this area potentially may be what's targeted if there are large industrial size marijuana grow operations, essentially, because that's the available land in the municipality. So with that said, I would like you to articulate just a little bit more on what you found specific to infrastructure needs that will be in those areas as you see this industrial land being developed for whatever purpose.
Sure. Perfect segue, thank you.
You're welcome. That was planned, by the way.
Oh, that's planned. So let me explain what I learned about in reaching out to the brokers who have in Denver who have dealt with some of this, a lot of the volume of transactions. Here's what ended up happening. At least earlier on, because it's still illegal federally, and therefore any federally chartered institution, particularly financial institution, can't legally get involved in financing construction of facilities, renovation of existing facilities. Everything still is cash. What ended up happening is in Denver, at least for the first half of the wave, marijuana growing operations, businesses put overwhelming demand into older existing industrial buildings in the Denver and Aurora area, near where the old Stapleton Airport used to be. Okay, but there's still along I-70. There's a gigantic inventory of existing older lean-tos, concrete tilt-up, not fancy but older, cheaper space. Growers spend a ton on power. I mean, the current figures are that 10% of the Denver metro area electrical use is now the marijuana industry. Full 10%. Okay, full 10%. But because of the cash restriction, at least at first, they moved in and took up all of the old industrial space because it was cheap, but it was already served by high capacity power. And water. Water's the other thing. That's tremendous, but power's the big one. Then what happened is that in short order, they drove up lease rates. Businesses who were in that space or wanting to stay in it couldn't afford to anymore, or decided that they would rather move into new space somewhere else and they kind of expand elsewhere. So what they did was they ended up moving to other suburbs and driving really kind of what was the second wave of in the industrial market there. All these businesses that kind of migrated because they couldn't expand in the old space, they moved out to further out suburbs and drove demand and growth in brand new industrial space. And I guess the lesson, the case study there is that I think older space in Anchorage that has the power capacity is cheap, and so lets them spend a lot, spend on the cost of power and water. But the site and the building is cheap. That's what's going to be taken down first and in major volume by industry. But what's going to end up happening is businesses who can't expand in that space, existing businesses, there's going to be a wave, or if it's anything like Denver, there will be a wave of those businesses to newer industrial development. And I think that that's where Chugiak Eagle River specifically.
So I may not get pot in my neighborhood, I may get Coca-Cola bottling plants.
That's
I'm okay with that.
that's the.
You're gonna get to share, don't worry.
That's the pattern that Denver saw.
We're gonna put it in chapter
And so
10.
and the only difference between the two really is that half of the industrial inventory is in Aurora and half it's in Denver. And so Denver has seen a lot of growth, but it's actually been more geographically dispersed. Anchorage overwhelmingly has that space relative to anywhere else. With that whole kind of second stage wave of businesses relocating, I think that's probably closer to what will be likely for businesses that might be going.
And we're still talking about industrial users that will still demand higher amounts of electricity because in industrial areas, that's the biggest expense.
They're going to want and require basically the same services they had before. They just didn't have the flexibility to expand where they were. They're going to want to move to where they can, but to where they can get those same services. And bottom line is, in terms of total space demanded, Anchorage is a very differently sized market. It's kind of isolated by two states, Washington and Oregon, that have legalized as well. Denver is surrounded by a bunch of states that aren't legalized, but the play in Denver is that they will, and Denver is ready to serve that market around them via the two interstate highways, the two major ones. So basically, I went through and kind of came to a 15% of Denver type number based on all those factors. And so if you look at how much industrial space was demanded by marijuana industry in Denver, and you make that adjustment, it's anywhere from 4 to 15,000 square feet of demand from the marijuana industry for basically growing operations, major growing operations, demanding high capacity power. And that just basically translates into an equivalent of 41 to 54 acres. Now, they're not going to come in, and given that Anchorage is a smaller market for the industry, they're even less likely to attract a lot of capital, private capital, because there aren't a number of states to try to invest to capture in the future. It's pretty much Alaska, okay, until Yukon Territory. If that ever happens. But the bottom line is that that 42 to 54 acre demand, that's actually kind of a measure of how much new industrial space might. However, the amount of existing industrial space that marijuana growing takes up, that's actually a better estimate of how much potential demand for industrial land, space and land is going to be. It's going to migrate because it's been taken by this industry. So, marijuana industry is not going to demand 42 acres to 54 acres of land, take down vacant land. They're going to displace that amount of use. That's the idea.
And I don't recall off the top of my head from the last presentation on our inventory of available industrial land. Do you know that number off the top of your head?
Let's see. In the fall,
When you figure out which one it is, let us know. We can switch to the same one.
This would be in the, for the bowl, a high range estimate of industrial land is 231 acres and a low range is 132. So somewhere between 130 and 230 acres in the bowl. Chugach Eagle River, in the industrial zones, an estimate of basically 187 acres in the industrially zoned lands. But Chugach Eagle River has a number of other lands that have industrial potential of 190 acres for a total of 380 acres in Chugach Eagle River. Again, with those access and utilities issues, 380 acres in Chugach Eagle River, up to 230 in the bowl.
We've got to end this meeting, unfortunately. We could probably go on for another half an hour, but thank you for everything you've given us. We appreciate it. Any questions from some of your members?
No, I'll just make a comment, Mr. Chair, that on our new Community and Economic Committee, I'll ask the clerk to not only put this under items of interest, but also the previous land study so people can actually see the map that has the inventory all over Anchorage. I think that's kind of where you're going. So I think it'll be helpful for especially industry that's here to be able to look at those inventories in different zonings and understand what's available where.
Thank you, Amy. This meeting's over with. Thanks for being here.